Welcome to Mind Love, episode 152. Today's episode is all about attachment theory in relationships.
Somebody said to me, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. And I'm like, I have both. And it wasn't until later I realized it's not genetics plus environment. It's genetics plus the stored perception of your environment. Just like you said, because of the beliefs you adapt or adopt from trauma about yourself or the world. And so because I did so much belief work with clients in my practice, what I then realized over time is that each individual attachment style actually has certain core beliefs about themselves and about other people. And I learned how to, so we put them into basically packages of being able to go, okay, this is my attachment style. These are the associated core wounds, so that then you can reprogram those exact core wounds with specific tools.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
Hi, friends. First of all, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you're always updated about new episodes. Plus, you want to know basically the best way to give back to your favorite podcasts? Actually go to the iTunes app and leave a 5-star review. Reviews are scientifically proven to make me love you more. That's just how it is. I love you when you leave me a review. You sit in my heart for days at a time. No, but seriously, they really help the growth of the show. They're probably the number one thing that you can do besides supporting my sponsors or joining the membership. So it's an easy, free way to give back to a podcast you love. And if you do leave me a review, send it to me at MindLoveMelissa on Instagram, and I'll send you a free meditation track. This week, I want to share a review I got from T. Chantel. She said, "My soul loves this podcast. I gain something from every single episode, and it feels like it fuels my soul and my self-growth. Melissa has such a calming voice. I love her morning Mind Love emails, and I look forward to waking up to them every morning." So thank you for that review. I loved it, and it totally lit up my week. But now into the good stuff. Have you ever noticed that you have certain patterns in your relationships? Maybe you tend to get a little too clingy a little too fast. Or maybe when it starts to get serious, you pull away. Or maybe you don't set any boundaries at all and then suddenly snap and lash out. I think I've done all of these things. But I think we all have patterns in relationships, and they might change or evolve over time, but we still tend to show up to a relationship with our own set of baggage, just ready to dump it out when we start to feel comfortable enough, or uncomfortable enough for that matter. So where do these patterns come from? Are some of us just born insecure or non-committal or a little bit clingy? Or maybe it has to do with how we were raised. They do say people tend to date their mothers or their fathers. Or maybe our patterns are reactionary to the person that we're with. I've seen my patterns totally evolve over time. And for the most part, a lot of my patterns seem to be the counterpart of the person I was with. In a few relationships, I was pretty clingy. That especially seemed to happen in relationships that I could just feel that they weren't really committing fully. Almost like if I could commit hard enough, I could commit for them. It's kind of sad looking back on those relationships because it was almost as though I was so committed I would put up with anything. Cheating, lying, emotional manipulation. One time even finding out that my boyfriend was cheating, doing meth, and secretly robbing houses. Yeah, my self-worth was obviously off the charts. Well, then I found a relationship with someone who wasn't a sociopath, and I remember almost being bewildered by his commitment. So I was the one who wouldn't quite go all in. It felt scary to me. I think a bunch of factors played into this. First, I was obviously afraid of being hurt so deeply, so to me the solution was simple. I just wouldn't let him in deep enough to hurt me that deep. I also think part of me finally felt good to be on the other side of that commitment tug-of-war. Kind of how kids that were abused often become the abusers. I mean, that example's kind of intense, but you get the gist. And then I think another part of it was that I was just able to feel secure enough to remember that I had real boundaries. And since I had never really been able to voice my boundaries before, I just went full force with them once I could. I don't know. I think we can analyze our past behavior endlessly and probably still only scratch the surface. I mean, we're complex little shits, you know? Well, thankfully, now I'm in a relationship that feels really secure. I spent a lot of time learning to love myself, or really just learning to be with myself and be comfortable with the person that I am. And I think the work that I did in that time I was alone really enabled me to find someone who fit the real me when I was ready. But man, what a journey to get here. And truthfully, most of the time I was just flying by the seat of my pants, finding help in books and in my own missteps, and doing the wrong things to learn what didn't work. Wouldn't it be great if we had a little insight into why so many of us approach relationships like parasites or abused little kittens? Neither of which is very attractive, I might add. We know where we came from, so what insight can we get from how we were raised and what needs were and weren't met so that we can make sure we heal ourselves now? That's what we're talking about today, specifically attachment theory. Attachment theory is the study about how our relationships with a parent or a primary giver basically create our expectations for how love should be. It's really, really fascinating, and I find that you get a lot of insight into how you're showing up in relationships today just by that insight. So our guest today is Thais Gibson. She's an author, speaker, and co-creator of the Personal Development School. She has a master's degree and over 13 different certifications ranging from CBT to hypnosis. And she's best known for her work and research on attachment theory and how trauma impacts our adult romantic relationships. She's also the author of the Attachment Theory Guide. And what's really unique about her work in this area is that she's created her own system, which integrates all these other aspects of ourselves, like our personal core wounds, our limiting beliefs, and our emotional patterns, all at the subconscious level, so that we can get deeper insight into ourselves and our relationships. 3 key things we will learn are how our early experiences impact our relationships through attachment styles, the inner beliefs that affect each attachment style the most, and how to reprogram our minds to transform the limiting programs that we're holding on to so that we can actually attract healthy relationships. But before we dive in, do you ever wish you could start each day with a little reminder that we're more than our struggles? Just sign up for the Morning Mind Love for daily inspirational messages right to your inbox. I get messages from people every single day about how the Morning Mind Love is their favorite way to start their day, or that the message that came through is exactly what they needed to hear. It's kind of like your own personal inspiration oracle. Just visit mindlove.com and sign up right there on the homepage. Plus, you'll get some amazing free gifts when you do, like a free guided binaural affirmation meditation designed to rewire your brain to your highest self. And you'll get one of my favorite tools, a booklet of my personal power lists to help you gain clarity and live each day with intention. And it's all completely free. Just go to mindlove.com to sign up. Or if you're out and about, text the word morning to 33777. That's morning to 33777. And now let's welcome Thais Gibson to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So to start out, what is your story and how did you become so interested in attachment theory specifically?
So my story is probably a pretty long story, but I guess the gist of it is I went through a whole bunch of kind of interesting childhood experiences, just like a lot of chaos and stuff in my home life and definitely some like big unresolved traumas that I'm not sure I learned how to deal with or even had the tools to properly emotionally process. And that led me to really having an outlet in sports. So I played Division I soccer and got a full scholarship. But far prior to that happening, as a competitive athlete, I had a big knee surgery when I was 14 years old and got addicted to my painkillers at that age and ended up like seeking them out and really having a big 7 or so year battle with addiction and daily use of opiates and just really trying to like struggle to figure out what was happening to me because it's sort of a lonely road at like 14, 15. I didn't know anybody else who's like addicted to painkillers and all that kind of stuff. So that set me out on a track for sure at a young age to be like, why, number one, have I experienced some of the things I'm experiencing in my household and some of the chaos? But number two, like, why am I not able to beat this addiction? Like it scared me. Like I had my first experience of going through withdrawals from something before I even knew what withdrawals were. So it's sort of like this scary experience. And it really got me in touch with like trying to figure out my mind and how the mind worked. And after trying a whole bunch of different things, like, inpatient rehab, outpatient rehab, therapy, all these different things, AA meetings, NA meetings, you name it. Nothing was really working. And one day I came across a friend of mine in a class. I was still like going to school and pretty high functioning as an addict, but he said to me like, yeah, the conscious mind can't outwill or overpower the subconscious mind. And it like shook my world because it really put into perspective this like struggle that I was going through internally on a daily basis of like, this is the last time, I'm not going to do this again. I'm done with this. And then, 3 hours later, I'm back to the same thing. And it's like, it's a very tormenting experience to go through addiction because you keep telling yourself, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. And then you keep going back to it. And it just feels like you're like losing this battle to yourself, which through him saying that, I realized was my conscious mind losing the battle to my subconscious mind. And it really opened up this perspective for me on trying to understand like, okay, what is unresolved within me that my subconscious keeps trying to escape pain through painkillers? And how can I correct those things at a deeper level so that I can have the healing and then not have to fight this battle? And so I ended up going back to school for doing a master's degree in transpersonal psychology, and then doing 13 different certifications, a lot of which involve the subconscious mind. So like your hypnosis, your NLP type stuff. I also did like CBT, internal family systems, all kinds of different stuff. But that then led me to open a practice. I went through a tremendous amount of healing as a person, which was really, really beautiful. And I'm so friggin' grateful for. And then led private practice for the better part of a decade, and then went on to open the personal development school just because I had this really long, like 2 years, so wait list for clients. And it was like, how can I serve more people and get this information out there in a way that's not me having to personally be there all the time? And so that has led to basically where I'm at today.
That's amazing. I have a few people in my family that are really struggling with opiates. And it's something that on one hand, I understand deeply because all the things that you describe, I could replace opiates with bulimia. And it was just a crazy thing. Like there was so long that I did not want to do it anymore, that it wasn't at all like, and it started for a purpose. It was like, oh, I can eat whatever I want and not have any consequences from it. And it really actually started from drinking because I would drink too much and be like, okay, I don't want to get blacked out right now. I'll just go like throw up some of it real fast. And to me, it felt like this weird little superpower. And then before I knew it, it took over my life. And for people who are familiar with bulimia that are listening, they know that it's not the best way to regulate your weight at all. You actually you'll like balloon up and then you'll shrink down and you'll balloon up. And it was about every year and a half for me, I noticed. I would either be overweight or underweight or whatever. And so it wasn't serving the original purpose whatsoever, but I kept going back to it. But as far as the substance abuse, I was always much more drawn to uppers than downers. And so I've always kind of been curious, when you're going through that at such a young age, did you specifically know I need my pills right now? Or was it like, I just feel uncomfortable right now? Like, were you tying together what that addiction really was? And what, in those moments that you were reaching for another pill, what was it that you were feeling or craving?
It's such a great question. And it's such an interesting sort of conversation about how things sneak up on you. Because at first, like, you get out of surgery and it was a pretty intense knee surgery and I was on crutches for 6 weeks and no weight bearing and all these different things. And so at first you're just like, taking these painkillers and you're kind of in this like daze post surgery. And then, a couple weeks in, I'm like not in pain, but I realized like, this just makes me feel like kind of good and just a little bit better and just like more calm and like things are easier and like kind of just that numbing feeling. And I'm definitely like, as a human being, like a big feeler and feel a lot and have a lot of emotions. And I think I was experiencing a lot of that and then experiencing a lot of fear around like, am I not going to get a scholarship because I just had this surgery? And there's a lot of still just friction and chaos in my house and a lot of just fighting and a lot of challenges. And it was like, it just made life easier. And then when I ran out, like I remember getting, faking that I was in more pain to get, my prescription refilled. And then it actually happened that I came across this girl who was a couple years older than me. And she was like, oh, you have painkillers. Like painkillers are also performance enhancers. And in my mind, I was like, oh, So this is great for me long term when I come back and I'm trying to like make up for lost time being an athlete, trying to like get a scholarship in the next years. So there were like a few things that played into it. And then she also happened to be somebody who is selling them, right? So I'm sure. But I was like, oh, okay. And then, finding that out and then running out a second time and knowing I wasn't in pain, but knowing that these things made me feel better. And then asking her and then kind of justifying it to myself for a while, like, oh, it's not a big deal. Like I had a big surgery and like, it's normal to like have to extend things and my parents aren't going to understand, like, and then it just becomes a slippery slope. And then, you're doing more of them and you're seeking out more and it has this sort of snowball effect. And then at one time I couldn't get them. And it was about 6 months into the whole sort of addiction journey. And I experienced withdrawals and I didn't know what was happening. Like I was like, oh, I have a flu, like I'm sick, but I'm like itchy and weird feeling and my skin's kind of crawling and then doing some research and realizing like, oh my goodness, this is a scary thing. And this like, it puts me in a different sort of component. And then it's funny because it's almost like that fear actually fed into it. It was like I started like identifying with like, oh, I have an addiction. And then it honestly made it worse. And it was sort of like then I started fighting it and being against it. And like, oh, I have to get over this, but it really put me in this battle from like that kind of tipping point forward. And it's interesting because I later learned something called the ironic processing theory in psychology. And it's this idea that your subconscious mind doesn't really hear negatives. Like if I'm like, don't eat junk food, don't eat bad food, what happens is because the subconscious mind speaks in the language of emotion and imagery. If I'm like, oh, don't eat cookies, don't eat donuts or whatever, your subconscious is like donuts, cookies, like, and it actually builds in like emotional sensations and it directs you towards those things. And so, it's like the idea, if I say, don't think of the pink elephant, like, oh, what do you picture? Like right away, you have a pink elephant come to mind. So what I realized looking back is the like, oh, I'm an addict, but stay away from this. This is bad. Don't do this. And that fight that was born within me was actually feeding the cycle at a subconscious level without me realizing. And I later learned that, and that was a pivotal part of healing. But it's so interesting the way we're not given like resources or tools, or we're not taught about the subconscious mind. And at the end of the day, our subconscious is responsible for roughly 95 to 97% of our feelings, our thoughts, our behaviors, and our conscious mind is 3 to 5%. So if we're not taught to tap into that like storehouse of everything that's happening, then we're really limited in our capacity to heal or change.
Before we go deep today, I want to give you a little gift, and I want to give it to you every single day. It's called the Morning Mind Love. I know how life can be. You're all fired up after an inspiring episode, and then a new day or a new challenge comes at you, and it's just hard to keep up that energy. Well, the Morning Mind Love is kind of like an oracle from your higher self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up or text the word morning to 33777. You know what's crazy? After all these years of hosting Mind Love and talking to some of the world's leading experts, one of the biggest eye-openers for me has been just how much our gut affects, well, everything. When my gut feels good, my mind feels clearer, my intuition is stronger, and I just feel more balanced. And that's why I'm excited about Zoe, a science-backed nutrition company that is totally changing how we understand our gut health. They've created the most scientifically advanced at-home gut test and built the world's largest microbiome database. So when you get your results, you're not getting generic advice. You're getting insights about your body that other companies just don't have the data to provide. There's also just so much misleading health information out there. Food companies even pay influencers to promote ultra-processed foods as healthy. And that's why I love that Zoe relies purely on science. Real science. The randomized controlled trial showed that participants were 4 times as likely to report better sleep and more energy, all thanks to the info from the largest microbiome database on the planet. So go to Zoe.com and find out what Zoe membership could do for you. And because you listen to Mind Love, you can use the exclusive code MINDLOVE10 to get 10% off membership. As a Zoe member, you'll get an at-home test kit and personalized nutrition program to help you make smarter food choices that support your gut. That's ZOE.com. Use MindLove10 at checkout. Trust your gut. Trust Zoe. I really relate to, you were talking about hearing from this one girl, which I don't know, I feel like she should work for Big Pharma at some point. Just like selling, like, oh, I sell this thing, but first let me tell you how amazing it is. But she basically got you to believe like, oh, well, this is also going to be really helpful. And that mirrors my experience with Adderall, where I remember learning, well, actually, first it was depression medication after my dad died. And I remember kind of Googling, the doctor said, well, here's one medication. And I wasn't really sure I liked it, but then I looked into it and I started to see all of these depression medications. And I saw that Wellbutrin specifically was also an appetite suppressant, or people would lose weight on it. And I was like, oh, interesting. And that kind of started my spiral on how can I find the next medication that gets me all of these other benefits. And you even hear about, oh, well, the birth control pill makes your boobs bigger and it regulates this. And there's like, and so I remember just having this, like putting medications on a pedestal, which is why now I'm so hesitant. Like, I'm like, okay, I better need this. Like, I will use it if there's something very, very wrong and it's the only way to heal. And I haven't tried any other healing modalities because I think it really affects your attachment to it. I did Adderall for over 10 years and it was like, I just held it dear to my heart. I was like proud that I took Adderall because it did all of these things for me. And I would tell people, oh yeah, I take Adderall. And certain people were also like, oh my gosh, you have Adderall? Can I have one? You know what I mean? And it's just like, it's crazy. And who knows how long it takes to, it reminds me of relationships, bad relationships where you're like holding them on this pedestal. And so even though they're basically beating you into submission half the time, you're like, but everyone else thinks he's amazing, or, but he did this one thing for me. You know what I mean?
I love that. I love that analogy. I think it's so powerful. And it's like, and what that really is in so many different things is that our subconscious mind, every single decision it makes is a subconscious strategy to get specific needs met. So it's like, oh yeah, like I stay in the relationship, and it's because you're valuing whatever needs are met from that relationship more than whatever pain is coming from it. And it's like the same thing. It's the same pattern with our addictions is like, it's like, yeah, I know that I'm like, this is a scary thing and I'm becoming addicted and I'm like this kid or, you know, you're on Adderall but it's like, oh, well, look, it's like an emotional connection piece because people are like, oh, cool, you're on Adderall, or it suppresses my appetite. And if that's a high need of importance that you're placing value on, then your subconscious will justify, oh my gosh, but it does this, and it will naturally ignore the red flags or the other components because it's valuing the needs that it's extracting from the experience so much further.
So this is actually a good segue into the idea of attachment theory, because I know how much childhood experiences do affect the way that we attach to things later on. But can you give an overview of what attachment theory is first?
Yes, absolutely. So the way I like to explain it to people is, and it's originally John Bowlby's work, but the way I like to explain it to people is that basically it's a subconscious set of rules that we use to relate to others and to attach or bond to others. And if you think of like two different people, and let's say we're playing like Monopoly, but each individual has a different set of rules for Monopoly. You know, one person has like the rules for Go Fish and the other person has the rules for Monopoly. And you're sitting there playing this game, you're going to run into all of these challenges because you have a different set of rules for how to play. And we have different attachment styles, and each different attachment style basically comes with a different set of rules for how to connect and relate to each other. And so it can become highly problematic, just as it would be if you're playing a board game with two different sets of rules in terms of how we navigate relationships and what we expect from relationships and what our fears and wounds are and the ways we give and receive love. And all these things are different based on what our attachment style is. And so until we figure those components out, things can be very limiting and we can take things really personally and we can have all these challenges and fears and misunderstandings take place. And so attachment theory basically encompasses a whole bunch of different ways of understanding the rules we have for relating to other people.
So given your experience with going through addiction and just having some struggles in your childhood, how did that affect your personal attachment style?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So what I guess I can share is like the different types of attachment styles, and then I'll share like what mine was and how it all kind of comes together for anybody who doesn't know. So basically, there's like a securely attached style, and this is what we're all trying to move towards, right? Is the securely attached person usually in their childhood. They have their needs met, they have their feelings seen and heard and held space for. And basically, as a byproduct of that, they learn, okay, my feelings are worthy of being expressed. It's safe to be vulnerable with others. My needs are worthy of being met, which creates an inherent feeling of self-esteem and self-confidence and self-worth. And, if I have a boundary or I need to communicate something, that's worthy of being heard as well and seen and understood. And so these individuals grow up to have like usually healthy, thriving relationships and higher levels of self-esteem and self-confidence. And then we have our three insecurely attached individuals or styles. And these all basically don't get those same sorts of positive programs with how we relate to other people. And so the three insecurely attached styles are at one end of the spectrum. It's dismissive avoidant. And dismissive avoidants are usually grow up in a childhood where they have some form of emotional neglect. And it can be like, a tremendous emotional neglect and physical neglect where a parent leaves or the parents are actually like neglectful or negligent. But then it can also be the under the radar emotional neglect. So like, the parents are good with meeting the physical needs, but the parents don't talk about emotions. Or maybe as a male, you're shamed for your emotions, or there's no emotional space held, or, children should be seen and not heard. These sorts of things that can otherwise fly under the radar because maybe all their physical needs are met and they're in a good school and they're eating well and, all these basic needs are taken care of. And so what happens from that is this child basically learns that, okay, my feelings should not be expressed. So vulnerability is bad and weak. And closeness to people doesn't feel good because it just feels like I'm being rejected by my caregivers when I try to express emotion. And so usually this person goes into their adult lives and they become hyper independent. They don't really like commitment or closeness. They'll often push people away in relationships when things get more serious or closeness is required. And they often have like a deep subconscious wound around shame. Because if you're a child and an important emotional need's not met, you don't have the capacity necessarily to go, oh, mom and dad are not emotionally available. Instead, you're like, oh, there must be something wrong with me. And so usually this person has that deep belief at their core. And so that's sort of like one end of the spectrum. And then the opposite end of the insecure attachment style spectrum, you have your anxious preoccupied. And this individual usually is very anxious in their relationships. They usually have a big fear of abandonment or being alone. And it's because they usually had a lot of inconsistency in their parenting or from their parents or caregivers in childhood. And so usually they had a lot of emotional closeness, but then maybe the parents were working a lot, or maybe one parent was warm and another parent was cold. And so this person usually fears that feeling of that love and connection being taken away because it was a wound for them in childhood. And so they go on in their adult lives to sometimes seem clingy or needy or very intense and not wanting to be alone and fearing abandonment. And usually the anxious and the dismissive avoidant attract each other in relationships. And so you can imagine, that board game, right? It's like one person's like, stay away, and the other person's like, come back. And it just creates this sort of funny cycle. And then our last one is the fearful avoidant. And so this is what I was. And usually this is the attachment style associated with like some form of trauma that's pretty consistent in somebody's upbringing. And so this can be because there's like lots of violence in the household, or there's physical fighting or abuse. It can be that there's just a lot of verbal fighting and intensity. It can be that one or both parents are drug addicts or caregiver, like one of the caregivers is an addict or an alcoholic. And basically there's some kinds of positive connection, positive associations built in with connection, like love feels good, but love can't be trusted, and love is scary, and connection is scary at the same time. And usually there's some big trust wounds in there too. And it can also be because of like a tremendous loss or some big family trauma that takes place at a young age. And so this adult usually goes into their lives and it's like, they want closeness, but then when people get too close, they become avoidant. So they sort of experience the anxious side of the attachment spectrum and the dismissive. And they're constantly sort of swinging from like, come close. And then you get closer, like, no, go away, get back. And so they're sort of the hot and cold partner in their adult lives. And that can create a lot of confusion for obviously the person of that attachment style, and they usually have some pretty big trust wounds to work through. But then it also can create a lot of confusion for other people who are like, oh my goodness, the person's so warm, and then they're so cold and standoffish, and they push me away. And so there's sort of a lot of swinging of the pendulum from anxious to avoidant for the fearful avoidant attachment style.
So fascinating, because I can listen to all of those, and it's almost like in different types of my life, a few of those have really stood out to me. I have definitely been anxious in my earlier relationships, but for some reason in my later relationships, I became more avoidant. And I've tried to look back into this to figure out like, well, I actually had a really great relationship with my mom. My parents were divorced, but I think one of the things that affected my relationships wasn't so much the parents that I had, well, other than maybe not really having like a stable dad in my life, but I moved schools all the time. Like when my mom met my stepdad, we had to move, and then there wasn't room in the school I was supposed to be in, so I had to go to one school for half a year, and then we got into the other school, and then we moved across the city, so we had to move schools because of the boundaries, and I was in a different school like every year for like 5 years. Could something like that, not directly being related to parents, just maybe other parts of your childhood or the environment that you were in, could that affect your attachment style as well? Could something like that, not directly being related to parents, just maybe other parts of your childhood or the environment that you were in, could that affect your attachment style as well?
100%. So a few things you said all can like make that impact. So if I want to sort of put it into parts for a second, because you raised so many important questions in one. So the first thing is like, can your attachment style change over time? And the answer is yes. You can be polarized across the insecure attachment style spectrum based on who you're dating. So like if you're with somebody dismissive, and let's say you're a fearful avoidant, like let's say you're in the middle kind of, you'll experience more of your anxious side of the fearful avoidance, because remember the fearful avoidant has the anxious and the dismissive. Then if you're with somebody who's really anxious, you'll become the more avoidant part of yourself. So that's one thing for people to notice. Another thing is our attachment style can change like at any point in time, just if there's enough programming that's taken place. So you can have somebody who's secure, and then they can go through a big trauma at like 15 or 20. And that can create insecurity in their ways they relate to others, like especially if there's, some kind of like scary relationship or some kind of loss of a relationship that you really valued. All of a sudden it can be like, oh my goodness, well, love feels bad now and scary. And so we can take that into future relationships. So those things can change. And then also to answer the third part, is for sure if there's like a big divorce and if one parent's missing, that can create an avoidant side of an attachment style or an anxious side. It can really go in both ways. And on top of that, if there's extra added instability, like you're moving around all the time and you can't just like get situated and settled, then for sure that will play a role as well. So, it sounds to me like you would probably fit the most with fearful avoidant, because you sound like you have sort of both of those sides. And then there was the moving a lot and like that inconsistency, and then the debt. And so there's so many dynamics, but it's such a, I think, great example for other people who are listening and are like, what am I? What might I be? And so all of those things will play a role. And I was fearful avoidant myself and for different reasons, but you can see like it's sort of the broad picture of what it means to connect with others, to relate to others, and how much stability and consistency is naturally in your life.
One thing I find really interesting is because I've been on both sides of the addiction spectrum, and there was a while that I was dating somebody that had an addiction. And so I started going to all of the Al-Anon meetings and learning about codependency. And one thing that really stood out, because people would always say, well, addiction is a family disease. It affects the whole family, because what happens, or even really anything, any sort of mental anything, because what happens is this one person is very set in their ways, or they have a certain way of being. And so the other people around tend to adapt to make it a more comfortable living situation, whether it's like something actually like an addiction or whether it's something like extreme ADD. And so it's what I found really interesting as I've evolved and learned more about myself is I really relate to being an empath, and I feel that it's getting stronger as I get older. And I know a lot of listeners out there feel like they're an empath also. And so it makes me wonder, are empaths more susceptible to kind of these fluctuating attachment styles depending on who their relationship is? Because they can feel so much the other person, sometimes even more so than what they're feeling on their own. Does that make any sense?
100%. So it's so funny. I actually like put a video on YouTube or something like yesterday or maybe today about like HSPs or empaths and your attachment style. And there's definitely a stronger correlation between being an empath and being either fearful avoidant and or anxious preoccupied. And a lot of the dynamics. So there's an amazing TED talk about this, but the highly sensitive person or empath is actually like a genetic variation. It's found on like DDR axon 7L4. And basically it's characterized by 4 key things. It's like depth of processing, being highly analytical, but also highly emotional. And then obviously like sensitivity to your environment and overstimulation and things like that. So you have these like components. And then I think if you're already that child and you come into the world, then I think you're very sensitive to like the way you attach to others and the bonds and what takes place. And so I think it sets a tone to be more likely to develop an insecure attachment style. But, it's so interesting because it's like there's all these beautiful things in learning your attachment style and learning your patterns and programs. And I think sometimes those same individuals with that really heightened sensitivity also maybe go through challenges and tribulations, but then also are more likely to be able to recover from them because there's that like depth of awareness into the self, if you're willing to turn that awareness and focus inwards. And then I think the more we heal as people as well, the more we naturally go back into being in tune with our feelings. And so it can feel like our sensitivity is heightened in a way as we heal as well. But I think that sensitivity that's heightened is actually bringing us back to like how we're supposed to feel. And then we have the tools to actually process our feelings and emotions and make sense of things and set boundaries and do all this sort of work required to be able to feel so much, but then to still feel like we're healthy and balanced in the world, if that makes sense.
It does. And so with your life experience of going through an addiction and all the things you went through in your childhood, how did that lead you to you said you were an avoidant attachment style, correct? How did that lead to that?
Yeah, so I was a fearful avoidant. So I was the one that's sort of associated with like the trauma, and there was a lot of chaos in my house, like a lot of fighting and physical fighting back and forth, and just like people not getting along very well, to say the very least. And so I think like, and both of my parents, I think, they're very like loving people and feel a lot, and both of them went through like a tremendous amount of trauma in their upbringing. And so obviously those things sort of get passed along. And so what sort of happened for myself is that both of my parents would speak to me a lot about the stuff that they were going through as well, and kind of like emotionally tell me things like about what dad did and what mom did and this back and forth. And I was very caught in the middle. And so I think from a really young age, I was like, feeling a lot. I definitely identify with being a highly sensitive person as well. And I was taking on all this like drama and chaos and what was going to happen and felt very responsible for other people. So I definitely also, like you mentioned, had these patterns of codependency to work through. And all of that is kind of associated with being fearful avoidant. And so a lot of what takes place is I think I had all these feelings, all of these unresolved emotions. They were all kind of just being like repressed. And then, painkillers come along and I'm like, oh my gosh, like something like makes me feel like what I imagined other people would normally feel like. And it just made life easier to do and navigate for a period of time. And then ultimately it sparked that really painful battle within myself, and that feeling like I was at war with myself and wanting to get sober and wanting to get healthy and being like, paranoid that the NCAA is going to drug test me and I'm going to fail and just all these like things. I'm like, I need to get over this. And then for me, like when I started learning about the subconscious mind, that was a big change. And then when I learned about attachment theory and how your attachment style has these specific core wounds and has these specific needs, and fearful avoidants are associated as being like quite codependent people and taking on other people's feelings and feeling responsible to fix or change or heal people. And so all these things were like really resonating with me, and it really gave me direction for like what to focus on next in my life. And so through like understanding my attachment style, through understanding the subconscious mind and the tools to overcome addiction, by realizing like the problem isn't the problem, it's not the painkillers that are the problem. They're not like jumping down my throat while I'm sleeping. Like it's actually the underlying trauma that I'm trying to escape from, that I'm carrying at a subconscious level, that's the problem. a lot of doing that underlying work and learning how to reprogram the painful beliefs I had about myself and other people because of what I had gone through. Learning how to understand my needs and understand that I have boundaries and not be codependent and actually advocate for my own boundaries and needs, and how that actually helped me to release resentment in relationships. Doing a lot of work on forgiveness and releasing resentment. A lot of these things long term, it's like once I could deal with all the underlying patterns and problems and reprogram them and reprogram that stored emotion in my nervous system and subconscious mind, then naturally the need for killing pain with painkillers went away because that pain had been transformed into something else. And so that led to definitely healing addiction, but also healing my attachment style.
You said something that really stood out because it was a huge part of a lot of the areas in my life I needed healing from. And you said when you started to learn to reprogram the beliefs. And the reason I think beliefs is such an important word here is because I remember after I started realizing, a lot of the things that are happening in my life right now are because of the trauma that I've gone through. At first, I didn't know what to do with that because I'm like, okay, well, now I've been traumatized. And so it ruined me. You know what I mean? And it didn't feel empowering. And it was when I started to understand that it's not necessarily that the trauma led to me doing this. It's that the trauma led to a belief about myself or about the world or about other people. And that belief is living in my subconscious and driving my behavior. So it's like the belief is the middleman between what actually happened and how your life is unfolding now, because that's the part that's driving the behavior. So when you start to notice, like maybe I'm this attachment style, how do you start to get to that middleman and understand what beliefs are attached to that attachment style so that you can start to reprogram them?
Yes. Okay. So you raised like the most beautiful point. I'm going to share a quick story about that because I went through the exact same realization as a human being. And I was in, I think, an AA meeting, or I can't even remember, but somebody said to me, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. And it was that same thing. I think it was 18 at the time. And I was like, okay, so genetics, my grandparents struggled with addiction and they say, it skips a generation. And I'm going, okay, so genetics, I'm screwed. And then environment, I had all these crazy things happen. And so I'm like, I have both. And it wasn't until later I realized it's not genetics plus environment. It's genetics plus the stored perception of your environment, just like you said, because of the beliefs you adopt from trauma about yourself or the world. And so what I created, so this isn't a part of regular attachment theory, but we sort of created integrated attachment theory. It was actually that because I did so much belief work with clients in my practice, what I then realized over time is that each individual attachment style actually has certain core beliefs about themselves and about other people. And I learned so we put them into basically packages of being able to go, okay, this is my attachment style. These are the associated core wounds, so that then you can reprogram those exact core wounds with specific tools. So for dismissive avoidance, a lot of the core wounds, one of the big ones is I am unsafe, something's wrong with me, or I am defective. I will be trapped, helpless, or powerless in vulnerability or in commitment. And then obvious things about I am weak if I'm vulnerable. I am weak if I open myself up. My emotions make me weak. So a lot of these big beliefs are the dismissive avoidant, which is the most avoidant attachment style, right? And then the anxious, preoccupied individual, because they have all those abandonment fears, their core wounds are I will be alone, I will be abandoned, I will be disliked, I don't belong, I am excluded, I am unsafe if I am disconnected. And so you can see these individuals, right? It's like the anxious person, if they ever feel excluded from a group activity or something like that, it's so painful for them. And so wherever we have a lot of pain, when we can convert it, because it's not the situation that causes the pain, it's the meaning we give to the situation. And that meaning that we give is usually highly personal, because it's not actually, out of all the meaning we could give to anything, it's not going to be about the situation. It's going to be about the meaning that's living inside of us that we carry in those beliefs, in those stories about ourselves, like you were mentioning. And so that's your anxious, preoccupied. And then our fearful avoidant, the biggest wound is usually I can't trust, I will be betrayed. And then beyond that, they have sort of the wounds from both sides of the attachment spectrum. So yes, some of the fears around exclusion, abandonment, being alone, being disconnected. And then a lot of big fears around being, what if I'm trapped, helpless, or powerless? They really don't like feeling like there's no control. Again, because usually if you're in an environment as a child where you feel like, whoa, this is crazy, it's so chaotic, the I have no control or I am helpless is such a profound wound. So that and I can't trust or I will be betrayed are really strong wounds. And then, deeper, more unconscious feelings of I am unsafe or something's wrong with me, and some of those shame feelings. And also I am bad. Fearful avoidants have a huge, huge issue. If they ever feel like they hurt somebody's feelings or do something wrong, they really struggle with guilt. So those are the core wounds, those beliefs that I've learned really are highly, highly likely to be accompanying each of those individual attachment styles, if that makes sense.
It totally does. And I get really excited about uncovering beliefs just because, again, like I felt disempowered by a lot of these things that had happened to me. Like, and the same thing where I'm like, there's so much addiction in my family. There's this in my family. Like, I'm just destined for this life. But what I found is that instead of looking at them in a negative way, the more you know about your past, whether it's your ancestral history or your own history, the more awareness you bring to it, the more you can use it as guideposts on how to heal. You can also use it to kind of skip around some of the pitfalls, because it's sort of like, okay, well, if I have a stroller with a shaky wheel, then you don't put all your weight on that last wheel. You know what I mean? You can kind of balance it out. And so you can view these things not as a roadmap to what your life is going to turn out to be, but as more of like, oh, well, here's going to be something that could be a struggle for me. So how can I build my life around that to where I'm reinforcing all the other areas so that I keep my strength? And so uncovering these beliefs is exciting for me. But when you do uncover them, what do you do with that then? So it's like we know our styles. We identify with some of these beliefs that we can feel when we hear. How do we start to reprogram that so that they don't just completely drive our lives into one exit?
I love that. So the $1 million question, right? So basically, here's what we know. So the subconscious mind, whenever we have, if you imagine like how something takes place, to give like sort of the mechanics to the listeners, if you imagine the trauma, like when we have a traumatic event, what happens is when we can't figure out how to properly emotionally process it, the mind tries to make sense of it by giving it meaning. So like, let's say, for example, you see your parents fighting and you go, I am helpless, or I am unsafe, or I am, and your brain tries to remember this so that if the event recurs, you can navigate it better next time. Oh, here's this thing, I'm going to be unsafe, so I have to do something about it. But the downside of that is that long term, because emotion imprints the subconscious mind, when there's a lot of emotion, we get these deep imprints, and then they become part of the story of ourselves at a deep level. And then we keep reprojecting that wound out onto everything, because these core beliefs we carry about ourselves at a subconscious level basically become part of our identity. And then we see the world and we interact with the world through that lens of these core wounds. So if I believe I'm unsafe, I'm probably going out into the world like thinking, oh my goodness, what if I'm out past this time and it's dark? Or, oh, what if this happens? What if that happens? And we probably think through that filter because it's a part of our subconscious identity. So we can use these same principles to actually reprogram. So what we know is that the subconscious is programmed through repetition plus emotion, but it speaks a lot more and it's imprinted a lot more quickly through emotion than through language. So for example, you can have no core wound that you're unsafe, but if you're in a building with an earthquake and the building falls down and all these people die around you, chances are you're going to have some nervous system stuff where you leave that day and you start feeling unsafe in the world, because the intensity of the emotion has the ability to imprint or reprogram the subconscious mind instantly. Versus we have something like affirmations, where you could have a belief from childhood that you're unsafe. And then every day you could go, okay, I'm safe, I am safe, I am safe. But here's the really big like catch-22 when we talk about affirmations. Because the subconscious mind speaks through emotion and not through language very much, if we say, I am safe, I am safe, I am safe, but we don't believe that, and in fact, we really feel the opposite, or if we go, I'm good enough, I am good enough, I am good enough, but we feel, very strongly otherwise, then what happens is every time we use an affirmation at the conscious level, it elicits a negative emotional response, which just reinforces that original wound. So if we go, I'm good enough, and we don't feel that way, and we've been programmed that we're not good enough, then we're going to spit out this feeling of like, no, but I'm not good enough. And so it doesn't really work. And so how we hack that system or that problem, the subconscious mind responds to evidence because it speaks through imagery. So if I say I'm good enough because I have this education or I have this award or this whatever it is, right? Every time we think of that thing, it contains an image. And that actually has the ability to penetrate the subconscious mind. And then the more emotion we can come up with in that image. So like, let's say you were so proud of yourself that you graduated from school and that day of your graduation, and you think about all the hard work and you feel, so the more we can get images and emotion, the faster we speed up the reprogramming process. So whenever we're trying to, given all of that information, just how it actually works is if you're trying to reprogram any core wound, you are trying to find pieces of evidence on a daily basis, because you need the repetition component for 21 days. So let's say I am good enough. You want 10 or 15 pieces of evidence every day for why you're good enough. And you want to lace that piece of evidence with as much emotion as possible. So I'm good enough because, and you want to feel about that, and you want to think about as many specifics as possible to find how you're good enough. And if you're doing that on a daily basis for about 21 days, especially if there's more emotion attached to it, then you will absolutely be reprogramming your subconscious mind. And one last little hack you can add in there is the subconscious mind is very suggestible first thing in the morning and late at night before you go to bed, because you're producing more alpha and theta brainwaves, which are the brainwaves you need to be hypnotized. So if you do these affirmation plus evidence reprogrammings early in the morning when you first wake up or late before bed, you can also speed up the process and also help to imprint your own subconscious mind more deeply.
I love that. I do something very similar. I've thought of it in sort of a different way, but there was a time that I was really working on abundance, and it was really hard for me to wrap my mind around abundance when I was broke and trying to first grow my business. And I had been working for a startup for less pay than it should have been for a long time. So this had felt like a lot of different things had been promised and then not necessarily panned out. So for me to start my own business, I knew I really needed to get a hold of this mindset idea. And so what I would do is I had to remind myself, because when you hear abundance, you often think about money, but I had to remind myself that abundance can apply to so many other areas in life. Like it could be that I have an abundance of love, or I have an abundance of energy. And so I would find the things that I knew I was already really sure about my abundance in, and I would go do those things. And then those would be the moments right after, like going on a little run or doing yoga or being with a group of friends and getting like a group hug. And I would be like, this is abundance. And then I would use those moments when I was at a heightened emotional state to really say, I am abundant, I am abundant, I am abundant. And then I would kind of envision what abundance looked like in this other area. And I think that was so powerful for me, because so often we tie this word that we think we have a struggle with one avenue in our life of what that could be. So maybe it's like, I am safe, and you're used to not feeling safe at home, but maybe there's just one person you feel safe with, or one spot in the world you feel safe in. And realizing that there's other areas, it's just your emotions, your negative emotions are so tied in this one. So you have to figure out how to basically hack your emotional state so that you can remember, oh, this isn't the only place for this to be. And eventually I can kind of adopt it, if that makes sense.
I love that. So it's so funny, because you're like, we're very in resonance. So the two things I tell people if they're stuck, because sometimes people have like such a belief that they're not good enough, or that they're in lack, or, they're like, I'm trying to give pieces of evidence and it's not working. And so I tell people, look in the 7 areas of life. So look in different forms, exactly what you're saying. So look in career, financial, mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, and all relationships, friends, family, and romantic. And number 2, you can start general and get more specific over time, because the idea is to reprogram, because everything else follows. Like if you believe you're abundant, you open up your reticular activating system, you start capitalizing more on opportunities, taking opportunities, thinking you're deserving and worthy. Like your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors or actions all follow your beliefs. And so, you want to, the idea is to reprogram, even if you feel so non-abundant now. And so another thing people can do is they can start more general. They can go, it's possible to become abundant or more abundant. And then they can look for pieces of evidence for why it's possible. And then they can go, I'm becoming a little bit more abundant than I used to be, or I'm learning about abundance, which is a step towards abundance. And then look for things like that. And then I think it's possible for myself to be abundant, and then find pieces of evidence. And then so you can warm yourself up to eventually being like, I am an abundant person, and then finding the evidence for that and then reinforcing that belief. So I love what you said, because it's like so in resonance, and it's really, really powerful to do that.
Wow. Yeah. It reminds me of an episode I did a while back with somebody who had discovered that there's 3 mindsets in order to really create a goal. And she realized that you needed to understand that what you were going for was possible, that it's possible for someone like you. And then the third one is that what I'm doing right now is something that makes it possible, is like a valid avenue to get there. And so what I learned from that is, first, when I'm going for a new goal, it's really important for me to find people that are already doing it, whether I'm following them online or I know them in my life and I'm like, okay, well, this person has built a business successfully. I just need to be around them so that I see that that's possible, not around all the people that are stuck in jobs that they hate, that have never thought that it's possible to get out of it. You know what I mean? Like, so show yourself that it's possible, and then start to find people that are like you or that have a similar story or that came from the same amount of money or whatever it is that you relate to the most in that starting point, so that you can see that people like you can do it. And then after that, once you really build that up, you're much more highly motivated to start getting down to the nitty gritty of, okay, now how am I going to become this person that holds this belief?
I love that. I think that's so beautiful and so powerful.
Well, thank you so much for everything that you've shared today. I feel like we could have talked about this for another hour, but you have a book for the people that are interested in it. So for listeners who are interested in learning more about you and the different types of attachment styles and how it applies to their day-to-day, where's the best place for them to connect with you online?
Yeah, so at personaldevelopmentschool.com, so all one word, we have a free attachment style quiz that comes with like a one-page report and a video report for you to understand the reprogramming of your attachment style. And then we also have in the Personal Development School, I've written and recorded about 35 different courses on everything from like attachment style reprogramming to belief reprogramming to like 21 different tools to reprogram all components of your subconscious mind. We have like an understanding your subconscious needs course. We have codependency and enmeshment courses, boundaries, shadow work, like so many different courses in there. And then they come with, I do 4 live calls with our students every week. And we have all these previous recorded webinars, and we have like a community in there and a Discord chat channel and a members forum and all these sort of really cool things. So there's all that stuff over there. And then I also put free content on YouTube every day at Personal Development School-Thais Gibson.
All of the links from this episode will be at mindlove.com/152. So your challenge this week, of course, is going to start with awareness. That's the first step really to any change. If you're in denial about where you're coming from, it's going to be really hard to get where you're going. So be honest with yourselves. How are you showing up in your relationships? What patterns have you noticed? What pattern are you noticing in this relationship or your last relationship? If you're anything like me, your patterns might evolve over time, especially if you're an empath or if you're a little bit codependent. A lot of times you will become the counterpart to the person that you're with. This can even happen based on what type of family you grew up in. If you had a really intense family member or a family member with an addiction or a mental imbalance, that even increases your chance of being that counterpart and automatically adapting because it was your way of survival when you were a child. So take notice of how you're showing up, what patterns are emerging, and also take notice of the patterns from your partner. If you are showing up in a completely healthy way in your relationship and your partner's just not, that in itself is a pattern. What are you putting up with? What are you settling for? At the same time, it might show you some of your blind spots in your own patterns. We tend to attract people that are on the same emotional levels that we are, maybe with different ways of expressing it. So if you have a partner that is doing something that you see as obviously unhealthy, ask yourself what inside you is attracting that. It doesn't necessarily need to be your behavior. It may just be your beliefs about what you deserve. It might be parts of your behavior that you can't really see or that you're used to denying. So again, bring awareness to some of this stuff and then apply what we've learned in this episode to see how you can start to change it or start to heal yourself first. So if this episode was helpful for you, or you are thinking of that friend who you know needs this episode, please tap the share button or take a screenshot and tag Mind Love Melissa and Mind Love Podcast and share it on Instagram. Also, feel free to reach out to me. I love hearing from you guys. I especially love understanding your biggest takeaways from each episode because it helps me become a better interviewer so I can bring you even better content since I will know better what resonates with each of you. If you haven't yet left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, that is so helpful. It really helps with the growth of the show, and it really brings a smile to my face. It's like receiving a love letter from someone you didn't know loved you. That's how I feel every time I get one. So, as always, thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.